Just days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, located 3,700 kilometers from Hawaii, was the scene of one of the most brutal assaults of World War II. At that time, the United States was still trying to recover from the chaos unleashed in the Pacific. Its most important base in the region was destroyed, and a vital part of its fleet was sinking in the ocean. The brutal conflict had knocked on the Americans' door, and the authorities in Washington feared that this was only the beginning. The new and fierce offensive on the small Wake Island confirmed their worst suspicions. The territory, defended by just 500 American soldiers, was plunged into a bloody battle against more than 2,000 Imperial troops, determined to annihilate any obstacle that stood in the way of its conquest. In this new military history video, we will learn all about the violent struggle to survive in one of the most unequal and fierce battles of the war in the Pacific theater. Strap on your helmet and get ready for action.
Well, I recognize they were Japanese because of their insignia on that thing, and I hollered over the phone, "Friendly planes held, open fire."
Long before the attack on Wake Island, or even the start of World War II, the relationship between the United States and Japan was tense. The possibility of a conflict involving both countries had been latent since the 1920s. In Tokyo, they imagined their empire as the natural leader of all of East Asia. With that view, they identified the great colonial powers with a presence in the region as their main enemies: Great Britain, the Netherlands, France, and the United States. The brutal First World War offered them a great opportunity, since the armies of these nations had suffered enormous losses, and during the following years they were forced to go through a period of rearmament. However, the Japanese were not yet ready to lead a new battle. The nation imported more than 80% of its oil and large quantities of metals, so it faced a challenge in terms of resources for the battle. Because of this, they decided to carry out an expansion plan, which sought to dominate territories where they could get everything they needed for a war effort and not depend on anyone. The main objective: China. The battle began with a brutal invasion on July 7, 1937. Ruthless killings and cruel abuses were part of the advance of the Imperial troops. The Japanese believed that as an Asian civilization, they had the right to control the region and refused to listen to Western demands to withdraw from the occupied areas. The United States imposed sanctions on Tokyo in an attempt to stop it. Embargoes were placed on various goods essential to its war machine, but that did not prevent it from continuing with its expansionist plan. While the violent attack on China was still in progress, Japan had simultaneously begun to put pressure on different colonies in Asia, such as the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, or the Philippines, a free state associated with the Americans. In this way, tensions between the Japanese and the Americans continued to grow, and even the smallest territory in the region was in danger of being next on the list of aggressions. That is where Wake Island comes into play. The Americans had taken possession of it in 1898. With no human inhabitants and no drinking water, the place seemed worthless. However, when relations with Tokyo became complicated, the 2 square kilometers of sand and coral rock on this floating space acquired a strategic value.
Wake was literally in the middle of a potential battleground between Japan and the United States. It was closer to Japan than to Hawaii, and only 600 miles from the Japanese Marshall Islands. And its location became vital in the 1930s because war between the two countries seemed ever more likely, especially after Japan invaded China and seized Manchuria in 1931.
A report submitted by the U.S. Navy in late 1938 recommended converting Wake Island into a base for land-based aircraft, seaplanes, and submarines that would protect Pearl Harbor from advancing Japanese attacks in the region. Following congressional approval and subsequent funding, American contractors landed on Wake Island in January 1941 to begin work on what would later become the first line of defense against an unstoppable enemy. Within 11 months, 1,146 construction workers had reached nearly every corner of the island, erecting seaplane facilities, a barracks complex, and other buildings. They also used their heavy excavation and grading equipment to provide the site with a road network and a landing strip. As Husband Kimmel, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, studied his maps at Pearl Harbor, he realized something disturbing. Each project completed by contractors and celebrated by higher-ups made Wake a more tempting target for the Japanese, increasing the likelihood of an attack if hostilities broke out. In mid-August 1941, the military drew on its limited resources to garrison the island. Its intention was to defend it with some 1,800 U.S. Marines, another 760 Navy soldiers, 2 fighter squadrons, and various types of bombers, an entire battalion prepared for a battle that seemed to be looming in the air. However, by December 4th, 1941, the American Legion was still far from Kimmel's ideal, but it already had 524 fighters, accompanied by anti-aircraft guns, 50 caliber machine guns, and a dozen F-4F Wildcat fighters guarding the island. There was just one problem. Japan's objectives were pointing in another direction, and 3 days later, on December 7th, it was proven.
On that quiet Sunday morning, Japanese bombers devastated the American base at Pearl Harbor. In just 2 hours, they sank or severely damaged 18 vessels and 300 aircraft, and killed more than 2,000 American servicemen. Admiral Kimmel had been wrong. The Japanese did not choose to begin the war in the outer islands like Wake. They had gone for the jugular in Hawaii.
The ferocious attack on Pearl Harbor marked a turning point in history. By then, Tokyo had already signed its agreement with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany and Benito Mussolini's Fascist Italy, joining the forces that had unleashed World War II with fierce fighting in Europe. Although the United States provided economic support and military equipment to its allies, its forces had remained on the sidelines of the battle. However, after the Japanese offensive, the American giant determined that it would not sit idly by and got involved in the fighting. However, before its troops could join the Western coalition on the various fronts of the war, they had to defend their own positions in the Pacific, and there was a suspicion that Wake could be the next step. In any case, the Americans underestimated the enemy, believing that the Empire of Japan would not be ready for a new assault so soon. The attack on this target began on December 8, 1941, just 1 day after Pearl Harbor, and it was brutal. The island territory, with a small garrison and few resources, had no radar or sophisticated air defenses to prevent what was coming. The overcast sky provided the best cover for a swarm of Japanese bombers that suddenly appeared and opened fire without warning. The destruction was enormous, and most of the American F-4F Wildcats were wiped out while still on the ground. In addition, the American personnel had no adequate shelters, so in the first hours of the offensive, they suffered significant losses. Many died without even having the opportunity to defend themselves, and many others were wounded, with severe burns due to exposure to the intense bombardment.
They came right over the top of this and caught the whole line of Wildcats in a row, ready to be fueled. They got every one of them on the ground.
7 of the 8 Wildcat fighters on the ground were destroyed, and 32 U.S. airmen were killed or wounded.
Even under attack, they were going to try to take off again. Well, those are the ones that get killed in their planes.
Dark moments marked by tragedy marked the beginning of the terrible battle at Wake. The Japanese army was filled with confidence after the first blow that took the American defenders by surprise. Thus, with the objective in flames and immersed in great chaos, on December 11th it decided to carry out an assault with troops landing on the island. There they would be met by the little more than 500 soldiers and some 1,100 civilian contractors who had been trapped in the combat while still working on the construction. The idea of finding themselves in defenseless territory after the bombings was quickly erased from the minds of the Japanese when they reached the coasts. The American defenders not only resisted the rapid enemy attack, but also inflicted serious casualties on the invading forces. 2 destroyers were sunk by the precise fire of the Marine artillery. One of the ships was even hit in its ammunition depots, causing a massive explosion that sent debris and bodies flying into the air in one of the most gruesome scenes of the battle. None of the crew survived, and some of them were literally vaporized in the detonation. The floating remains in the water after the battle were the symbol of the violence of that confrontation. The Japanese attempt at conquest had been a great mistake, motivated by overconfidence. The aviators who participated in the initial bombings reported that all the defensive installations on the island had been destroyed. For that reason, the assault was carried out with a small number of vessels and only 450 soldiers. The commanders of the Imperial forces believed that this would be enough, but they were wrong. The fierce resistance of the Marines gave a great turn to the speculations of their enemies, who found themselves involved in a violent scene.
I jumped into the water with my rifle and ammunition and waded about 80 yards until I reached the shore. Our unit leader was killed directly in front of an enemy position by a machine gun round. We couldn't advance because of all the machine gun tracer fire. We just hugged the ground and could do nothing but stare at the scene.
The troops in Tokyo were no longer the hunter in this story, but had become the prey. The battle was on par with the brutality taking place in Europe during the same period. It was an intense fight for survival, but the incessant fire made it an almost impossible task. The American artillery did not stop under any circumstances. The sound of the shots was constant, and it mixed with the screams of pain of the opponents who were falling one by one. The Japanese forces suddenly understood that their incursion was turning into a resounding failure and decided to return to their initial tactics. The troops took a step back, and during the following days, the air and naval bombers returned with the objective of weakening the American defenses before a new landing attempt. In North America, the fierce resistance on the small island was celebrated with great fanfare after having suffered from the attack on Pearl Harbor.
The Wake Island Marines' stunning defeat of a Japanese naval fleet was cause for national celebration at home. A grateful President Roosevelt was able to announce America's first victory of the war.
There were only some 400 United States Marines who, in the heroic and historic defense of Wake Island, inflicted such great losses on the enemy.
The Americans celebrated, but at no point did they move forward on a plan to reinforce the defenses of Wake Island. Meanwhile, after that first landing attempt failed catastrophically, the Japanese command understood that they seriously underestimated the American resistance. In their case, they did decide to send support to the area, including more powerful naval units, such as aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. Tokyo was not willing to give up on its plan of conquest, so it added new infantry troops to the operation, increasing the number of forces to about 1,500 soldiers. This time, they tripled the number of rival combatants and were determined to crush the defenders. Everything was ready for a second assault. In the days before the new landing, the air attacks intensified, firing mainly against the trenches and improvised fortifications to eliminate any possible refuge for the Americans. To counter them, the handful of F-4F Wildcats that had survived the first bombing took off to confront the aggressors face to face.
The Marine pilots, thirsty for revenge, also attacked the Japanese squadrons head-on, even though they were often outnumbered 10 to 1. One pilot who especially loved dogfights was Captain Henry Elrod.
He was utterly fearless. He liked nothing better than getting in close with the enemy. During one air raid, he knocked down 2 Japanese bombers, 2 Nell bombers, in rapid succession, and that's how he got his nickname, Hammering Hank.
Despite the best efforts of the American soldiers, on December 22, 1941, a new assault was launched, and this time it would be much more devastating. Under cover of night, which was suddenly illuminated by intense bombing, the Japanese finally managed to land their troops on Wake Island. The invading soldiers, trained for hand-to-hand combat, landed in 2 key areas of the territory. They knew that the American defenses were weakened after several days of air fire, and their objective was to deliver the decisive blow.
Japanese troops who did survive the landing took their attack into the thick brush behind the beaches.
Fighting when the Japanese come ashore is vicious. It's hand-to-hand. The Japanese battle tactic calls for bayonet charges, called a totsugeki. And the idea is to close with the enemy, take him with your bayonet, break his lines, coming from the side and attack from the back. The Marines, on the other hand, are behind emplacements. They have heavy machine guns, and they're just laying waste to the Japanese as they advance.
As the Japanese penetrated the American lines, the situation quickly devolved into brutal, face-to-face fighting. Many of the defenders, especially the Marines, had already exhausted most of their artillery and small arms ammunition. They used rifles, pistols, and bayonets, and even their bare hands to resist the invasion. The fighting was fierce and bloody. Imperial troops, equipped with katanas and bayonets, stormed trenches and dugouts, killing many U.S. soldiers in close-quarters engagements. The Japanese also used hand grenades and flamethrowers to dislodge the defenders from their fortified positions. Where the Marines thought they would take cover, they were turned into death traps in which they were brutally killed. Later reports indicated that many were burned to death or severely mutilated by these tactics. Despite the enemy's superiority, the American forces would not surrender. However, by this point, they were virtually out of ammunition. The coastal artillery and anti-aircraft batteries that had been key to repelling the first assault were either inoperative or out of shells. Those soldiers who were still able to fight did so with small or improvised weapons, facing an overwhelmingly superior enemy. The best strategy was to stick together and use the little fire they had in a single point. In this way, they advanced against their rivals in a heroic act.
We immediately returned fire, concentrated fire, and we heard one scream, but again, we didn't know if there was more than one person or what we had hit until we advanced far enough to come upon 4 dead Japanese soldiers. I was astounded. I looked at them, and I had a lot of different emotions. I knew they weren't the pilots, but they were the people that represented the pilots that had harassed us so much and had scared us so much. I thought, there they are, helpless.
Beyond those victorious moments, as the Japanese assault continued, the Americans found themselves increasingly outnumbered and out-equipped. Organized defenses began to crumble, and small groups of Marines fought for every inch of ground, aware that given the brutality of the enemy attacks, surrender was not an option. In many cases, they preferred to fight to the death rather than fall into the clutches of Tokyo's troops. After several hours of savage battle, where the invaders showed no mercy and massacred their rivals, the end came on December 23, 1941. The American commanders, aware that they could not win the fight, decided to wave a white flag to announce their surrender. With their men on the verge of exhaustion, they chose to preserve the remaining lives and hand the island over to the Japanese. The confrontation had stained every corner of Wake with blood. It ended with the deaths of some 700 Imperial soldiers, a figure that accumulated during the first failed landing and the final fighting. For their part, the Americans suffered around 120 casualties, while some 1,500, including civilians, became prisoners. The fate of this last group became grim. giving an indication of the brutality of the war in the Pacific. While most of them were sent to detention camps in Asia, 98 people remained on the island as laborers. But in retaliation for American air raids, the Japanese marked the brutal fate of these men in 1943. They were forced to dig their own mass grave and then machine-gunned in an act of extreme cruelty. Although it was a victory for Tokyo, the resistance of the American defenders had a significant symbolic impact. Wake Island was the only base in the region where U.S. forces managed to repel an initial Japanese assault. That action proved that the Imperial Army was not invincible and provided a psychological respite at a time when news of American defeats in the Pacific were piling up. The heroism of the defenders of Wake was widely celebrated in Washington, and although the territory remained under Japanese occupation until the end of the conflict, the resistance in this remote place remains an example of courage and determination under adverse circumstances. Now, after having learned everything about one of the most brutal battles of World War II, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next military history video.